Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we ask, must politicians always be truthful? It often feels like many politicians themselves think not, but what does healthy democracy demand? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Most of us probably want our politicians to speak the truth. Indeed, research done here at UCL and elsewhere identifies honesty as one of the top values that most people want their elected representatives to uphold. Yet many politics insiders see such views as naive. Representative democracy, they point out, is competitive. Politicians who play too nice will lose, and those who are willing to play dirty will thereby dominate the field. But should we renounce the ideal of truthfulness quite so quickly? What are we giving up by doing so? And are we, in fact, giving up too much? Well, a recently published article argues that the answer to that final question is, in essence, yes, that truthfulness should be seen as part of democracy's very core. And to explore that argument, I'm delighted to be joined by one of the article's authors. He is Richard Bellamy, Professor of Political Science here in the UCL Department of Political Science. Richard, welcome back to UCL Uncovering Politics. It's great to see you on again. And perhaps I should start just by checking. I gave a kind of quick summary of the argument in your article there. Have I adequately captured the core of the argument, or would you like to put it in different terms?
No, I think that's right. I think what motivates it anyway is this apparent mismatch between what the general public think, which is that politicians ought to be honest, and it's a terrible failure of them that they're not, and the view of many insiders and some political theorists who adopt a kind of neo-Machiavellian view that it's something you can't expect of politicians.
So what exactly is truthfulness? The word that you use in the article is truthfulness. What do you mean by that?
Yes, so that's deliberately done. And it's because the thought is that actually to define certain things as necessarily being true is not something that we can always do it because there is a certain degree of judgment about that. But what we can do is give people reasons to believe that what we are saying has qualities of being truthful. And here I adopt the criteria of the moral philosopher Bernard Williams, who in a book on truthfulness identified two elements of it, what he called sincerity and accuracy. So take, an area where we like to think truth might lie, namely natural science. And what we expect of scientists is that they give accurate findings from their experiments, but also that they're sincere, or if you like, honest about how they present them, that they don't remove from their findings things which contradict their hypothesis, that they're open in the way in which their experiments could be replicated by others to see whether they find the same sort of results. And although we know that much natural science, it's the way of it, gets challenged by later generations of scientists, what allows that to happen and what leads to us having credence in what they're doing is that they've done so in ways which have these truthfulness qualities. And so in like manner, I think one can expect of our politicians that they are open about what they think the evidence for the particular policies they have achieving the ends that they claim for them are, and that they are sincere and open about that. So we want those same two qualities from them.
So honesty isn't kind of included within that, but is part of a kind of collection of concepts there that all add up to the idea of truthfulness.
Exactly.
Good. Why then is truthfulness so important in democracy? That's a big question, going right to the core of your
Sure.
argument. But do you want to just take us through the key steps in that argument?
Yes. So, I mean, here in part, I link truthfulness to some work by a political theorist at Harvard, Beerbohm. And he argues that in the ethics of electioneering, politicians make two sorts of claims. They make what he calls testamentary claims, when they sort of say, this is what I stand for, and they make promissory claims about how I'm going to bring about the better world that I'm promising you, or achieve the values that I'm telling you. My argument is that if they're going to deliver on those, then we need them to have those qualities of truthfulness. So that we want their testamentary claims to be sincere and their promissory claims to be accurate. And it becomes legitimate to punish them if those two things turn out to not be true. So, for example, it's often thought that the claims made by certain populist politicians like President Trump are that they claim quite a lot that they're going to make America great again, but maybe the ways by which they are charting that are not particularly accurate. They put forward policies which are likely to achieve absolutely the opposite of that. That's a way in which these two things can pull apart. And I think making not just politicians, but citizens aware of that is an important thing, so that they know what they're judging politicians on.
So is that an argument for saying essentially that the core of democracy is it's a mechanism by which voters can get politicians who will deliver what the voters want? In order for the voters to be able to choose the politicians who will do that, they need politicians who set out their stall honestly. If the politicians don't do that, then they're kind of defrauding the voter at election time and promising things that they're not actually going to deliver. And therefore, that kind of relationship between the voter and the politician that is appropriate in democracy is broken down.
Exactly. That's very well put, yes.
And you also have an argument in the article that relates to another political theorist. We're mentioning lots of political theorists in the course of this discussion,
Yes.
and you're really building on all sorts of different bits of work that have been done, namely John Rawls, who talks about the concept of reasonable disagreement in politics, and reasonable disagreement also being a core part of what is going on in a democratic context.
Yes. So one of the thoughts is, why is it that we might need democracy in the first place? And one reason for that is that people can have disagreements as to what the best ideals for our society to realize might be. And even if we agree on that, what might be the best mechanisms for achieving those goals? And we accept this diversity in part if we accept that there can be, different parties vying for power that put forward rather different platforms. I mean, they may all claim in the most general terms that they want to do what they see as being best for our country, as it were, and all of its citizens. But their view of what is best and how to achieve that may differ, and reasonably so, in the sense that it's just possible to have different priorities about both values and mechanisms. But we'll still want them to be truthful about those different goals. I mean, one reason for voting for politician A rather than politician B is that even if you like what politician B is saying, you might sort of have doubts about how realistic it is, and therefore think politician A is a superior bet to go for, given the circumstances in which we find ourselves. So it's important that you, in these circumstances, that you have politicians who are truthful. Otherwise, it becomes hard to weigh up the pros and cons of each of them.
That's interesting. When I read the article, I was interpreting, I think, those two arguments that we've just gone through as being rather separate from each other, whereas the way you've just described them, they feel more connected. So I guess I was thinking of the first argument that you offered as kind of quite a transactional argument in which there are voters who have certain things that they want, and there are politicians who are offering certain things, and the politicians who win ought to be the ones who are giving an honest offer to most voters. But that's quite a kind of transactional relationship. Whereas the second argument about reasonable disagreement, I guess I saw as being something where there's more of a transformational process among voters in discussing the options available and thinking about what the appropriate way forward is, where we're coming to a kind of hopefully collective view as to what is the best thing for the democratic community as a whole, for the society as a whole. And it's only by being honest with each other and sincere with each other in expressing our different views and ideas that we're able to genuinely come to a reasoned conclusion as to what is best for the community as a whole. So is that unfair that I'm thinking about two different views of the democratic process?
I think it's part of that, but I also think that there's something slightly different, which is that what one should come also to a appreciation of is that people do have different views, and therefore, yes, it may not be possible to satisfy them all, but in a certain sense, we shouldn't necessarily demonize people for having views which are different from ours either. We should try to come to an understanding of why it is they differ. Also, in communication between citizens, truthfulness then becomes an important feature, because it's precisely then that that perhaps you'll understand that you don't have knockdown arguments against all of your people with whom you disagree. And maybe there's some sort of basis on which we can agree to disagree or seek to mutually accommodate our different views. And so related to this is also a concern about how in contemporary politics, I mean, there's a tendency these days to either sort of say things like, it's just my opinion, or that's just your opinion, a phrase I hate whenever I hear it on the radio or whatever, or to somehow think that everybody is a liar and nobody is telling the truth. So I think, against those who say, oh, that's just your opinion, I think I want to have from them, what's the basis for your opinion? What are the values and the facts that inform it? And when we ask that of each other and expect, that should raise everybody's game in terms of what they do. And it also can lead, I think, to mutual respect, whereby you won't just think that people are lying, making it up as they go along, or indeed that's all anyone can do, which I also don't think is true. So it's not a relativistic argument I'm putting forward, but just as we accept that scientists, for example, and even in the exact sciences can have disagreements about things, they put forward different views, but then they seek in various ways to find ways of arbitrating between them. And to achieve that, they require notions of truthfulness to do it. So I think we should be doing that as citizens and as politicians, and that will lead us to have a higher view of the worth of and practice of democracy.
And you also contrast this view with two alternatives that I guess deny that there is reasonable disagreement.
Yes,
So you talk about technocrats and populists, both of whom in different ways essentially say some people know the correct answer and some people are in the way of getting the correct answer.
yes,
And the task is just to follow the people who know the right answer.
that's right. So I think that both of these schools of thought, as it were, have tend to deny, as you said, the notion of reasonable disagreement. The technocrats tend to think it's unreasonable because the technocrats should be able to agree on an expert consensus, which is motivated towards achieving the best for all of us. And I think there's been a tendency amongst democratic politicians to become part of such a consensus, often delegating important tasks to these so-called expert regulatory bodies, be they utility regulators or courts or the central bank. And that leads citizens to feel that important decisions are being taken out of their hands. I think it also, in a way, prevents politicians from doing some hard work and thinking and justification for their own views. And I feel is wrong on the one side, but on the other side, a reaction which sort of says these elites are just pursuing policies in their own interest. And here are people who are going to speak to the real people in some sense and give them what they really want. They, in a weird way, are doing much the same that they accuse the technocrats of doing. And
yes,
in the same way are poorly serving citizens. So, yes, the aim is to try and get away from both those, what you might call deformations of democratic politics.
So in short, in order to have a hope of a democratic process that gets towards outcomes that people will be satisfied with over the long term and that will hopefully satisfy a reasonably broad range of people across society, we need to have conversation that accepts reasonable disagreement and that is truthful and sincere and honest. Otherwise, we're just going to go off in bad directions. That's
Talk.
a very crude summary of the argument.
That's right, but we'll talk past each other, and the incentives on politicians of all stripes to do better will be lost, I think. I think, it's a tendency which has existed for some time that politicians put a great deal of effort into denigrating their opponents and rather less effort, perhaps, into developing their alternative positions. And I think that's unfortunate.
Okay, let's consider some possible counter-arguments to this view then. And you mentioned 3 counter-arguments in the article itself, which we might go through in reverse order, actually, from how they appear in the article. So the first of them is about the idea that sometimes politicians and leaders need to engage in lying or deception in order to protect the security of the state. Sometimes the stakes are just very, very high and you need to prevent bad actors from outside from doing bad things, and that requires you to lie sometimes. How do you respond to that?
I mean, there are, I suppose, some examples which might seem to justify this. So, I don't know, think about the D-Day landings when the Allies wanted to trick the Germany into thinking they'd land in certain places rather than others. And in doing that, inevitably misled some of the British populace as well. So you might sort of say that was justified. You could nonetheless say that there should have been, and no doubt there was to a degree, some form of accountability for the actors doing that they had to justify it at least to their cabinet colleagues. And it wasn't a self-interested move, and arguably one for which they could be held account later on. They didn't try to hide doing that afterwards. So you could sort of say, if it's something that you're willing to freely admit to in the aftermath of this, maybe it's one of those rare examples which is justified. So I don't want to deny that such things can happen, but I do want to sort of say they should be rare. And as I said, the sign of it is that you're willing to own up to it when secrecy is no longer required.
And you have a lovely quote from Bernard Williams where you say, "We have reason to want politicians who acknowledge the uncancelled moral disagreeableness of lying in this way, because only those who are reluctant or disinclined to do the morally disagreeable when it is really necessary have much chance of not doing it when it is not necessary."
Yeah.
I thought that was a nice way of putting
Yes.
it. That, yes, okay, maybe politicians do have to lie occasionally, but they should do so with great reluctance and recognise that it's problematic. Yeah. Okay, so that's one objection. So you're allowing a little bit of softness around the edges there, perhaps. Yeah. Another objection is that, well, how far does your argument go? Doesn't it count against all form of spinning, all forms of rhetoric? And isn't that just going too far to be credible, that we would imagine our politicians not even to engage in rhetoric in order to advance their cause?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think even academic prose, particularly perhaps amongst political theorists, it can be a matter of good presentation. You know, there are certain people like Bernard Williams who were magnificent writers. And I think there's a great deal of persuasiveness in the way in which they indeed write. So I wouldn't want my argument to deny the role of spin and winning people round to your argument in that way. But I also think that should always be open to challenge. An aspect of a democracy is that, you know, you accept that you can be challenged and criticized, and you, in line with my reasonable disagreement argument, shouldn't seek to question the sincerity and accuracy of those who are putting you to the test. It should be accepted as a legitimate thing to do. So I think if politicians are able to get away with what's sometimes called post-truth or fake news type of rhetoric, then in part it's the opposition who are to blame for not taking them sufficiently to account for that. And I sort of liken what happens in a common law court, where you tend to have prosecution and defense, who of course both use a degree of rhetoric to try and convince the jury. But the fact that they're open to have their assertions questioned should, one hopes, put a limit on how far they're willing to spin the material that they've got.
I was very struck when we did a citizens' assembly on democracy a few years ago, and we ended up talking about these issues quite a lot, that people often talked about how they felt disrespected by politicians who spoke dishonestly, because they had a sense that those politicians weren't treating them as equals, as equal interlocutors, but rather as people to be manipulated to serve the politician's will, essentially. And I guess what you're saying is that there's a dividing line between respectful rhetoric that does respect the interlocutor and regards them as an equal and isn't trying to pull the wool over their eyes on the one hand, and disrespectful rhetoric that is really trying to mislead them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's precisely the distinction I'm trying to make. Yeah.
Okay, let's go on to the third counter-argument then, which is the counter-argument that I was kind of hinting at in the introduction, and that, I guess, to me as an empirical political scientist, is the most intriguing counter-argument, which is basically, can politicians possibly win in the real-world democratic game if they are as scrupulously truthful as you're suggesting they ought to be?
Yes, I mean, I sort of relate this to a topic which I've also written about, which is that of compromise. And compromising is sort of one of those supposedly paradoxical virtues, So people say, well, why should I tolerate views that I think are ridiculous or pernicious? And yet we tend to think that toleration is a good quality to have in society. But there's always that tricky limit, which of at what point am I tolerating the intolerable? And likewise with compromise, there's at one level we often think that could be a virtue, but then other views that I shouldn't compromise with, and so in systems unlike the first past the post, though increasingly also in first past the post, actually, the notion of compromise is quite a common one, and parties challenged by how far should they just stick with their program and not be willing to sacrifice any of it, and how far should they be prepared to sacrifice bits of it. And what happens, I think this is the example I give in the piece, if they know beforehand that they're going to get rid of one of their platforms, but they use it in the election to garner that extra bit of support that they need to get them into office. So I give the example of a party which is committed both to abolishing nuclear weapons and raising welfare, and they sort of know that the nuclear weapons one is likely to have to slip. I think that in systems where it's common to have compromises, etc., parties do tend to be relatively honest as to what the schedule of priorities is amongst their programs. And I think that isn't necessarily something which loses them support. On the contrary, it can be something which garners them support. Mm. So, I mean, I cite some empirical evidence cited by somebody else in support of this. I can't make a claim to have rigorously studied it myself. But as a casual observer of at least two systems where compromise is pretty regular, namely Germany and Italy, it is my impression that people have a pretty good idea who it is that the parties are going to align themselves with in any likely post-election settlement, and what kind of compromises might be required. And those who, as in my example, know that their bit might get jettisoned, might still think, well, it's been important that this issue of nuclear weapons got raised and discussed in the election. And maybe over time it'll go further up the set of priorities and the change will occur through that. Or if they feel sufficiently strongly, they'll join a party which is simply about that issue and see if that gets into. So I think there are ways of dealing with these things which are consistent with truthfulness as I see it, and that in general, I think they will improve the quality of democratic decision making.
And just to give maybe an analogue to that from the UK context, I've always been a bit mystified as to why cabinet ministers in the UK think that cabinet responsibility means that they must manifest utter belief in every single policy that the cabinet pursues, and that they never say, or very rarely do they say, well, we had a conversation around cabinet, it was difficult, different people from different departments were representing their own bit of the overall pie, but together we came to a collective view, and now we stand by that view. I mean, it strikes me that way of describing where they come to as a result of cabinet responsibility would come across as more honest to most voters than politicians standing up saying they believe X when There's a long history of them
Sure.
in the past having said that they believe Y and Z. So I can see that in some circumstances, what you are saying certainly makes sense to me. I guess, though, when I look at something like, would Labour in the 2024 general election in the UK have got the majority it did had it been honest about the fiscal situation and about the need for either spending cuts or tax increases after the election? And it seems to me at least plausible that the answer to that is, at least in the short term, given the nature of our political discourse as it is, that they would not have secured that victory had they been honest about that. And therefore, what do they do? I can see that
Yes.
we can try to reconfigure our political discourse such that honesty would be rewarded, but without doing that work in advance, and Labour wouldn't be able to do that work from opposition, it faces the challenge of, well, how do we get elected in order to do good things in government
Yes.
if honesty would prevent our election?
I don't know. I mean, post-election, one feels that they would have been in a much stronger position had they been honest, because they've opened themselves up to a huge amount of buyer's remorse and accusations of cynicism as a result of not having been sufficiently honest. And maybe, for example,
And I mean that relates to you talked about Beerbohm earlier, and some of the evidence that you cite is from Beerbohm, who
yes,
says there's considerable evidence that citizens are willing to punish candidates for breaking promises and pledges, but that relies on the politicians being sufficiently long term in their horizons to be looking beyond the next election when they're
yes,
campaigning in the course of an election campaign and thinking about what will maintain our popularity post election, whereas the reality may be that they're just focused on what will get us into office in the first place.
yes. No, that's true. I think, I mean, had they suggested that they would have had to raise taxes in order to deliver on some of their public service commitments, I find it hard to believe that they wouldn't be in a stronger position now than they are. And I'm not convinced that such realism would have been punished, because after all, there'd been plenty going on with the Conservative series of administrations to suggest that people would be expecting quite a lot of a fiscal gap there. Maybe they should have trusted the population more to not be expecting miracles.
Interesting. Final question then. We're running out of time, as we always do, but is there anything that could be changed in order to enable or encourage politicians to be more truthful than they are at present? Should we be looking at institutional reforms, at
Yes.
ways of somehow changing the culture?
Well, I mean, to some degree, I think that, there's a lot of concern about politicians and, in some cases, public servants and their rectitude. But I think maybe citizens themselves need to start improving as well. Perhaps you get the politicians that you deserve. And if they are critical of politicians for a lack of honesty, maybe they should themselves look to that, though how one can encourage people to do that, I think is a tricky question. I mean, there almost certainly is there's no clear answer to this question, no magic solution. But I think that potentially a more proportional electoral system would encourage an improvement in the way in which politicians debate and argue. And who knows, potentially I think if one had a way in which the moves towards more localized government, which happened both in England and, of course, with the devolved nations, if there was more of a role for those people who are the mayors and the first ministers to have a formalized role in political debates, I think that might improve things a little bit too, because that would formalize, what has been an important change in British politics, and one which I think involves, in a way, having the diversity of the state represented. Because I think we didn't really talk about it, but good representation lies behind truthfulness, as it were, that the two go hand in hand. And I think that maybe there's a tendency of local politicians to be more straightforward. I mean, there's more of a direct link to what they do and the impact it has on people's lives. And maybe that would be a welcome breath of fresh air in our politics if we had local politicians playing more of a role in how national politics is developed.
Yes, that's a bit of the paper that we didn't talk about on the nature of representation. But you talk about how representation, good representation, is kind of a dialogue between the represented and the representative. It's not just a sort of one-time thing every few years at election time.
Yeah.
That's much easier to do in an unmediated way, particularly at a local level, than it is on a very large scale. And we see some evidence that smaller scale democracies tend to be more successful in many ways and have greater public support than do larger scale democracies. Well, Richard, this has been fascinating, and I could go on talking for much longer about some of the institutional changes that we could introduce. You've talked there about electoral systems, you've talked about bringing politics closer to the public. I guess I also think about the role of the media in all of this. And in the UK, in some senses, we're quite lucky with the BBC, which is an institution that is designed to embody the principle of reasonable disagreement and the idea that there are different views that deserve to be heard together. Whereas, if we look at the US media market, for example, we don't see mass market media outlets that have that kind of approach to political discourse. But there's still so much more that could be done and so much more to explore. So, Richard, we will look forward to having you back on again when you've had a chance to dig further into these questions as well. But it's always wonderful to hear your thinking and great to discuss these matters with you. So thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you very much, too, for having me again.
We have been discussing the article Truthfulness, Pluralism and the Ethics of Democratic Representation by Richard Bellamy and Sandra Kruger, currently available on Early View in the British Journal of Politics and International Relations. As ever, we will include the full details in the show notes for this episode. Next week, we will be exploring the role of the law in creating and in tackling structural injustice. To make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of time to rate or review us too. I'm Alan Rennick. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham and Kaiser Kang. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.